Okay, this is chapter 1, part 1. So we're going to get into some introductory materials. You probably have been exposed um, to much of this material in previous courses. So hopefully this is going to be straightforward and is going to serve as sort of an overview. Really, when it comes to statistics, repetition's a good thing because, at least in my experience, teaching this and learning statistics, it tends to be very slippery, and you think you have it one day, and then it's gone the next. So bear with me if some of this is familiar, but I think it will help. Let's begin with this first point here. This is, by the way, taken from chapter 1 in the Andy Field statistical textbook. The purpose of this course is to learn how to answer interesting questions about the social world with quantitative data. And what we mean by quantitative data is numerical information derived from observation. Okay, so what we're doing is we're trying to measure something about people. This course is a social sciences course. We're trying to learn something about people through measurement and reducing that that thing about people that we're trying to measure, reducing it to a numerical value. So, you got 100 on the test. That's taking your performance and reducing your performance on that test down to a number. So that's, with testing, that we do this sort of stuff all the time, measuring your performance with numbers. That's all we mean by quantitative data. We can also, of course, analyze whatever we want to about people using qualitative data or non-numerical data derived from observation. So all this comes from observation. That's the scientific approach, is to observe things and then measure them. So the way that you can think of qualitative data is really to think, I think it's good, as the textbook does, to use this term categories. That oftentimes purely qualitative data is categories. For example, a category like male or female. Those are really categories that cannot be reduced to meaningful numbers. They're just different categories. And so there's a lot of things in our social world, social reality, that are categorical and are not really conducive to being reduced to numbers. But also, you can think of categories, but you can also think of words. We can think of qualitative data as being focused on words as opposed to numbers. So that's a shorthand that I always like to use to differentiate these two. Quantitative data about numbers, qualitative data focuses on words so you're studying, for example, people's words as opposed to, how well they do on a test out of 100 points, that kind of a thing. Okay, now the research process. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this. This sort of stuff is covered in detail in a research methods course. But quickly, let's review. Number 1, we begin with an observation that we want to understand. Number 2, you consult a relevant theory and derive from it a hypothesis. You collect relevant data. Number 3, number 4, you analyze the data to see if the hypothesis is supported. And 5, you examine your results and how they impact the tested theory. Example, the theory is supported or not supported with the data that backs it up or doesn't back it up. And maybe if it doesn't back it up, maybe you need to tweak that theory a little bit or adjust it. If the data does back it up, that gives you more confidence that your theory is valid. This very quick process that we just kind of zoomed through here, this, by the way, is a deductive approach where we tend to go from theory to how, you start out with a theory and you from that derive a hypothesis, which then leads you to the type of data that you collect, which you then use that data to test your theory. So that's a deductive type of theory. An inductive type of theory is one where we simply start with the observations, with the data, with not going into it with any sort of theory that we're going to test or any preconceived ideas. We just want the data to speak to us and lead us toward conclusions, lead us towards an explanation, a theory of whatever, for the data that we're studying. So in the case of an inductive approach, you start with the data and you move towards an explanation or a theory. Now, this variable is an important term. Again, much of this is review. Bear with me. The variable is a phenomenon of interest that varies from case to case, where case refers to the individual units that you're studying. Very often with stats and research methods, this stuff is very vague unless we put examples on it. So I constantly will use examples to help, make more concrete what we're talking about here. So a variable is anything that we're studying here, and for us, it's in the social world, social reality. Uh, a variable is something that is different from person to person to person. If usually our focus in the social sciences is to focus on individuals. Why is it that this person is different than this person? Um, if we stick with this example of test scores, how come this person is getting better test scores than this person over here? Uh, and so it's a variable. If people perform differently on that test performance is a variable. Some people aced it, some people really struggled, some people in the middle. And so so variable is a term you understand. It's anything that we're studying where it's different from person to person to person. If it's not, if it's the same person to person to person, then we call that a constant. And that tends to be something less important in research. We rely on comparisons, on differences, on variables to study, and not where everybody's exactly the same on something. So you don't see too many studies on, like, the number of noses that different individuals have, because generally speaking, not with 100% certainty, but for the most part, humans have, from individual to individual, everybody's got one nose. So we don't study that because it's the same for everybody. It's it's when you see variation that you begin to wonder, well, how come we see that? How come some people are super rich, wealthy, and some people are super poor? That's the huge, enormous differences there. What's going on there? See, so that's what we usually study, are differences, the variation, and that's where you get this term variable. A case refers to the the individuals that you're comparing. Now, typically in our research, it's going to be individual people. So you have a list of people that you're studying. That say you give your class 30 people a test, and then you get a test score for each person. Each person, you can think of that as like a sample, a study, and each person in that class who took that test is a case. They're one individual, one unit that they'll call it, because they say unit because maybe you'd use the same statistics, the same methods if you were studying biology and studying mushrooms or something. So they use units to refer to any of the individual things that you're comparing. But usually for us, it's individual people. Uh, so variables important to understand, and case is important to understand, because those are terms that I will use in the future when we're doing stats and stuff. I might say variable and case without explaining myself. So make sure that you understand what that means right here. Now, dependent variable. Um, there's two types of variables: independent variables and dependent variables. The dependent variable, which also we'll call sometimes the outcome variable, this is a variable that's affected by other variables. For example, maybe income is affected by a level of education. The more education that you have, maybe that predicts greater income that you earn. And so it's a dependent variable here because income is influenced by education. So any variable that gets influenced by other variables, we call that the dependent variable. The value that you have on income, the score, the amount of money that you make depends on your education. So therefore, income is a dependent variable, right? So it's very important as we're analyzing these variables throughout the semester that you're able in your mind to conceive, okay, which variable are you thinking is the dependent variable, and which one do you think is the independent variable? And that's what we want to talk about next. The independent variable, also called the predictor variable, this is a variable that has an influence on another variable. So in the case that the example that we just used a moment ago, education is the independent variable because it has an impact on some other variable. In this case, on your income, how much money you make. More education tends to lead to greater income. So independent variable is think of that as the one having the impact, the one that's making a difference, the one that's influencing income, the dependent variable. We also call that predictor variable. Independent variables, we'll call them predictive variables because they predict values on the dependent variable. So if you come to me and say, oh, yeah, I have a master's degree in business, then I can predict based on that, okay, well, so you probably have a pretty decent paying job because you're a highly educated individual. You probably are not, are not homeless with an education like that. Now, of course, I could be wrong. It's only a prediction. Predictions are just predictions. They're sometimes right, sometimes wrong. But see, we use data to see connections between variables. And if there's a strong, strong connection between education and income, then if you have a high level education, then you're probably doing pretty well. There's a high chance that you're making a good income, right? So that's another term that again might be helpful to you conceptually to understand what we're talking about here. Think of it as a predictor variable. Okay, income is that education predicts how much money you're going to make, right? So it's predictor variable. Level of measurement. Now, this is important and sometimes a little bit confusing, but just bear with me on this. I'm sure you've seen it before. But this is very important in statistics course because you have to know, it's very key, you have to know the level of measurement for each of your variables to know what the proper statistics are that you need to use with those variables. So it's very important that you kind of spend a little time and get comfortable with these different levels because that absolutely will be key down the road throughout the semester. So by level of measurement, variables are measures at several levels of quantification ranging from categorical to highly quantitative. So yes, if at the one level, I don't want to think of it as like low to high, but I suppose it's okay to think of it in terms of low to high, because from the statistician's point of view, the more highly quantitative the variable, the more refined the variable is in quantitative terms, kind of quote unquote, the better it is for statistical purposes. It doesn't mean that it's intrinsically better, it just means it's better for the statistician. Categorical would be the least helpful to the statistician because it's not numerical, it's not quantitative. We talked about male and female before as being two categories of gender that that you can't put meaningful numbers on those. We use numbers to sort of create an order that the person, you got 100, meaning that you scored higher than somebody who got an 80 on the test. See, so there's an order there that goes from low to high on quantitative variables. But with categorical variables, there's no low and high. There's no which gender is high and which gender is low. Gender is not something that implies an order from low to high. They're just different categories. And so to the statistician, I mean, that's real life. That's the way it is. But to the statistician, it's a little bit more of a problem because it's not numerical. It's not quantitative, so it makes it a little bit more of a challenge to analyze categorical data. But that's the one end of it. And then on the other hand is highly precise, highly quantified data that the statistician likes, for statistical purposes. So there's a range there. That's what they mean by level of measurement. Categorical or nominal variables, that's what we just talked about. Gender is a great simple example of that. If we're focused there on two categories, that two's as low as you can go. This is a variable where cases fall into various classes or categories. Gender, with typically you see two, but perhaps you could see additional categories as well on gender. I put here perhaps you have three of male, female, and other. Again, these are always definitional issues and are not necessarily clear-cut and black and white issues. But just to keep things, simple for educational purposes, gender makes an excellent example when we have a focus on those two categories, male and female. So think of that category. So category just means it could be at least two categories. It could be up to many, 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 many categories. But those categories have no order from low to high. There's no way to have a ranking or an order that goes from a low number to a high number. So they're just categories. And that's what we mean when we say either categorical or nominal variables. And you have to use a particular kind of statistic if you're dealing with categorical variables. We can analyze them quantitatively, statistically, even though they're not really quantitative. We can get around this problem, but nevertheless, make sure you understand what we mean by categorical or nominal variables. Binary variables that are sometimes called dichotomous variables, and sometimes, I don't know where this comes from, that they also will sometimes call them dummy variables, maybe just because of their simplicity, I'm not sure. That these are all, there's various terms for these concepts. Bear with me, forgive me that people can't decide on one term. There's always more than one term. Binary, dichotomous, dummy. And all this simply is a categorical variable. It only has two categories. Binary, yes and no, for example. Do you agree with this policy? Yes or no? That's a binary categorical variable. So that's what we mean when if I ever use those terms, that's what I mean. It's just two categories. Let's see. Let's take a break there. We'll continue on with part 2.